We continue in chapter 23. In one word, chapter 23, miyuchadim, unity. Speaking about the act of the Creator within creation that creates a gap between God's perspective and our perspective. We are separate, independent beings from our perspective, and from God's perspective, we are totally bound up in one with Him. How do we bridge that gap? Well, in this chapter, that's what we're speaking about. That we can bridge that gap. Be miyuchad, to be united and bound up. So we spoke about that there's the inner will of God. The inner will of God is His Torah and mitzvahs. That's what He wants from every single one of us. To be united and bound up with Him. In 3 degrees of connection, or 3 manners of connection. And that bridges the gap between His perspective and our perspective. Our reality of being separate and yet being able to be bound up with God. So, let us proceed. One way is through a mitzvah to be bound up. And in a mitzvah, that incorporates a physical action. So in that physical action, there are 2 elements that are involved. So for example, if you extend your arm to give charity or to do an act of loving kindness, so you have the limbs of the arm and you have also the power of action of the godly soul that is engaging in that deed. That physical limb is bound up with God, united with God, because remember, that action is something that He really wants, as opposed to what He only wants is a means to an end, like creation itself, something we spoke about at great length previously. What He really wants is inner will, is the mitzvah. So in the act of the mitzvah, 2 elements again that are involved. The physical limb that is involved in that mitzvah is bound up and united with God. And the power of action, which is from the soul, because we have a body and soul that engage in doing a mitzvah. So the soul component, which has the power of action, is also united and bound up with God. So the Alter Rebbe gives 2 metaphors here to appreciate the distinction between them. So the power of my soul to do an action is united and bound up with God, metaphorically, like a body and soul are bound up and united with each other. Now, I got a body right here, you have a body and a soul. That's why we're alive, right? So, and they're united. They're fused together as one. That's a great union. So likewise, when we do a mitzvah, our soul is bound up with God in that act because it has the power of action. So it's bound up like a body and soul are united in one together. Now, the limb, the physical, now comes even further, that the physical limb of a person is bound up with God. Not just the soul, and that's how we would maybe think about a mitzvah, that the soul would be bound up. But no, the body too. How's the body bound up? and bound up in one with God. So the metaphor the Alter Rebbe gives is like a chariot. Just like a chariot is ridden by its rider, it has no will of its own. It's totally subjugated to the rider. So likewise, and therefore there's it's not a complete union like body and soul, but it's subjugated. So likewise, though the limb that is engaged in that act of charity or that act of loving kindness is subjugated or kind of united with God, with the divine, in that act of doing the charitable deed. And that's why the patriarchs were called the Merkava, a chariot, because every limb of their body was totally bound up to God in being connected to God. So likewise, we are that way in the times that we do a mitzvah, a physical act of the mitzvah, and that's what we're talking about over here. So it's a powerful idea that not only is the soul bound up in doing an act of a mitzvah, but the physical body is bound up with God in the act of doing a mitzvah. I would suggest that that's probably a novelty in how we thought about things. Doing good is something of the spirit of the person, and therefore any connection you're going to have with God will be, so to speak, in the spirit of the individual to the Spirit of God. Well, of course, the Spirit of God. So that we get. So that our soul is bound up with God is understood. No, it goes a step further. The actual physical being, the limbs that are involved, right? So, for example, if you're walking to do a mitzvah, I did that this morning. I walked here to pray. That act of walking, right? Because I'm going to do a mitzvah, I'm bound up with God. I'm bound up in that act. How am I bound up? Not just in my soul, but my physical body in going to fulfill the mitzvah of going to pray. Now, if you took your car, so we're talking about the physical body over here of the individual, right? Is bound up in the act of prayer itself, right? Moving your lips. So you would think, only the soul is bound up because after all, there's a spiritual thing. No. Much more profound than that. The physical reality of the individual, because you engage in the action. And that's what God wants. He wants that action. He wants that action. And this is the novelty over here, to think that he wants the intent, the feeling, and the mindfulness. Absolutely, and that's something we'll get into later. But the novel idea over here is that in the action itself, I'm bound up in my physical reality to God. That's beautiful. Now, it's not as deep a bond as my soul is bound up in the physical act. The soul is bound up metaphorically, like a body and soul are bound up and united as one. Right. I mean, so much so that you look at a person, you can't differentiate where's the soul begin, where's the body begin. It all is fused as one. That's how the soul is bound up. The power of action of the soul is bound up with God. But the physical limbs are also bound up, metaphorically, like the chariot to the rider is subjugated. The chariot is subjugated to the will of the rider and goes, wherever the rider wants the chariot to go. So likewise, there's a union. There's a a bond between the physical reality of the person that's engaged in the mitzvah of that hand that is now giving charity. So the physical limb itself is united with God, like the chariot and the rider. Something to think about.